A short verse this morning here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 6. But what we find ourselves position-wise, I should say, is at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments of the Decalogue. And the way this is going to function is, and I kind of gleaned at this last week in last week's sermon at the beginning or the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5 here, is that we will cover this, which serves really as the finality of the theological basis upon which God is giving the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments, the covenant obligations of his people. And then next week we're actually going to be having a standalone sermon that transitions us into the time of Advent, and so that by the time we come back in the new year, in mid to late January, I believe it is off memory in the schedule, we will then actually be commencing our exegesis on the Ten Commandments, and we will go through every single commandment week by week, and so that we gain a thorough insight into what is the very heart and foundation of the law of God. Our reason for doing this, other than thorough learning and thoroughly having the Word of God expounded into our hearts and our minds, is that as we have seen and covered in passing before throughout this book, the Ten Commandments, or the Decalogue, serve as the foundation of the law. All the law of God that moves through its various different categories, from covenantal law to civil law to ceremonial law and so on, things which we'll explain when we get onto those sections, find their root, their basis in the Ten Commandments. Every possible law that you find in the Old Testament, some which still are extant and which apply unto us, some which have been fulfilled in Christ and in his holy work, all trace back to these fundamental laws of God, which are given for our benefit and blessing. And we're going to see part of that here this morning when we examine this verse 6 of chapter 5, wherein God says, "I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." This, again, to reference something I mentioned in the introduction last week also, is in classical form of these ancient treaties that we find historically in the records of archaeology between kingdoms and between tribes and other such different polities, wherein the basis of the more powerful king in that setting would give the authority by which he is then able to actually make declaration or make treaty with his new vassal. And here Yahweh is doing the same, but with an entirely unique fundamental premise. And we're going to divide this into two particular parts here this morning for us. Despite this being, of course, one sentence, I'm going to partition it into two sub-clauses, we might say. The first of which is the first couple of words, "I am Yahweh your God." And the second sub-clause being obviously what follows, "who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." And when we've broken it down into those two sub-clauses, you'll see how they build to what is quite a remarkable lesson. One that applies, of course, not only to the Israelites to whom he is speaking, but also one that transcends time and history itself, one that contains within it eternal principles. That first subclause, "I am Yahweh your God." Herein we would have found in archaeological settings the naming of the king and his kingdom, what his powers are, what his authority is, and he would of course be swearing by the gods of his nation, singular or plural, especially in the case of the powerful kings around the ancient Near Eastern world, be they Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, so on and so forth. They themselves, those kings, those emperors, would be swearing by the God who they were actually conceptualized as the embodiment of. We've explained that on a number of occasions, especially when we were looking at the conquest of the two Amorite kings on the eastern side of the Jordan in previous chapters. The kings and rulers of the ancient world were considered, not only by themselves but by their peoples, to be the very incarnation, the very embodiment of one of the national gods, one of the most significant of their various pantheons. In the case of the Egyptian pharaohs, they were the embodiment of Horus. In the case of the kings and emperors of Babylon, they were the embodiment of Marduk, the national god of Babylon, and so on and so forth. They were swearing by a higher authority whom they were intertwined with themselves. But nonetheless, this sense of transcendence was what they would be articulating. They would be swearing by and making oath, that is to say, cutting covenant, to use the words of the end of chapter 4, by virtue of themselves being the embodiment of a particular deity. The reason why this particular line here, and especially this first subclause, I am Yahweh, your God, is so significant and indeed so unique is the fact that, as the scriptures say elsewhere, Yahweh swears, he makes oath by himself. He swears by his own name. We sing this when we sing the hymn, for example, the God of Abraham praise. I think I referenced this last week off memory. He by himself hath sworn, we on his oath depend. There is no higher name, either in heaven or earth, than the name of Yahweh, who is the one, the true, the eternal creator of all things, visible and invisible, above and below. He is the one true God. There is no higher authority by which he can swear than by himself. And this stark proclamation, I am Yahweh your God, tells us two things in particular. The first of which is that God is personal. He is personal. Many of the gods by which the ancient peoples would swear were really, in essence and in practice, the embodiment and the personification, as we would say, of the natural elements. They were the god of fire, they were the god of the winds, the god of the sea, the god of the sky, the god of love, etc., etc., etc. The reason why the ancient pagan world was polytheistic, as we would say, poly meaning many, theos meaning God, polytheistic, many gods, and having a pantheon of all the various gods that they would have, is because those various deities, those various gods, were the personification, really, of creation itself. Each particular god not only had something that they were powerful over, but they themselves were really, truly the embodiment or the personification of that particular natural element. The corruption of ancient paganism was the elevation of the created world to a status of divinity, and the abandonment of the worship of the one true God who actually created that very, as the name suggests, creation. It was elevating and worshipping and idolizing that which had been made as opposed to the one who had made. It was the elevation of the material over the spiritual. It was the elevation of the one who is transcending of creation and transcending of time itself over those who have come forth from it. This is the very reason why in Jeremiah, for example, which is written predominantly in Hebrew, there is a portion, I believe in chapter 10 off memory, wherein Yahweh speaking switches into the vernacular of the Assyrians and of the Babylonians and of the nations around them into Aramaic. He switches mid-sentence into the language of the pagans, and he says to them, all those, that is to say the gods, all the gods who have been brought forth from the heavens and the earth will be crushed beneath the heavens and upon the earth. Those who have come forth from creation, the gods, will be crushed beneath them, because Yahweh is God over that very creation. This is the purpose explicitly for the incredible imagery and the incredible language that we find in Genesis chapter 1. This God who creates this primordial chaos, this in Hebrew tohu vabohu, this emptiness and this void, and he then orders it. And he does so systematically, day by day, with the exact same repetition and pattern that we find replete throughout Genesis chapter 1 on multiple different layers and levels. This is the God of order who orders chaos. And ironically, the gods themselves were thought to have come forth from that chaos. This is how they were conceptualized. Genesis 1 flips that entire image on its head and identifies and proclaims unto the world, no, The creator of this did not come forth from it. He instead was the one who brought it forth. And he is personal. He is not merely a force of nature. This is exemplified most powerfully, especially in the book of Exodus. The people to whom he is speaking here, especially these ones who, as Yahweh says in verse 6, this one who brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, in Moses' quotation all the way back to Exodus 20. Yahweh displayed this powerfully in the Exodus itself. The bringing forth of various plagues and locusts and other such things, transforming the Nile River into blood, bringing darkness upon the land, etc., etc., etc. All of these various things, when you were to go through those chapters of Exodus, you find that every single one of them is a direct attack, might we say, on the pantheon of Egypt, on the council of the gods of Egypt, each responsible for the Nile, for harvests, for the sun and the sky, and so on and so forth. And Yahweh was demonstrating that no, these false gods are not in charge of these things. They are not actually the rulers of these various aspects of life and society and civilization. Instead, Yahweh is God over these things. And the operative word we have here, especially in regards to this personhood, is I am Yahweh, your God. He is not merely an impersonal force of nature. He is not merely one who has created and ordered things and then is transient and passes us by and has nothing to do with humanity or with the world at large. No, he is personal. He is personal by nature, and he is personal relationally. That is to say, with how he interacts with humanity and with the cosmos itself. I am Yahweh, your God. And keeping in mind here that while we're getting a quotation on the part of Moses, this is Moses literally speaking in chapter 5, he is directly quoting what, of course, God said to him upon Mount Sinai back in Exodus chapter 20, which was the first giving of the law. Moses here is just simply repeating it and reinstituting it for this new generation. When Yahweh is speaking to Moses and giving these commands, he is, as I've just suggested, speaking. He is verbalizing. Moses is hearing the creator of all things speak to him. Moses, a man of flesh and bone, with ears and a brain, is hearing the sound of the creator speak to him. And the very body which had been given by God unto this Moses is now hearing these words. It is God speaking to his creation, just as he spoke that very creation into existence. I am Yahweh, your God. He has a mind. He has a will. He has a voice that he then enacts. He speaks forth this will. He speaks forth that which has been conceptualized and enacted through his intelligible mind. God is personal. He is not vague. He is not generic. He is not an impersonal force of nature. He is Yahweh, your God. Relational. And the second thing this tells us as well, this first particular clause here, is that God is holy. When this very Yahweh encounters Moses in Exodus chapter 3, in that famous and seminal setting of the burning bush, wherein fire in this, what is actually a thorn bush, when translated out of the Hebrew, this thistle, this fire that is transcendent, this fire which is eternal, but this fire which does not consume. And he hears the voice coming forth from this burning bush. And Moses asks him, what is your name? What shall I tell the sons of Israel is your name? And he says to him, Echye asher echye. I am who I am. I am that I am. I will be that I will be. It's difficult for us to translate because of how philosophically and metaphysically deep the words are that this Yahweh actually speaks to Moses. It is a statement that he is the self-existent God. He is the one who is. And this is why, by the time we get down to the Gospels, when Christ, this very same God, who is actually the Logos, the word that Moses heard, when Moses is hearing God, he is hearing the Son. He is hearing the Logos. He is hearing the one that we call the Christ, the Word of God. When we get down to the Gospels, especially in the Gospel of John, which is our New Testament reading for the liturgy at the moment, it is built around these 7 I am statements, as we refer to them in English. Ego eimi, I am. And here that is Christ blatantly identifying himself as Yahweh, as this divine God from the Old Testament. I am. Because indeed to Moses, that very same Christ, which by the time we get to the Gospels is now incarnate, is now in the flesh, he had said that once in ancient times to Moses in the burning bush. Who shall I tell the sons of Israel that you are? I am who I am. I am is my name. Who are you? I am. Because there is no greater metric by which we are able to measure or evaluate this God. He transcends all life. He transcends all material. He transcends all time. He is beyond. He is above. He is other. He is distinct. The essence, the substance of his divinity, of his deity, is entirely separate. It is entirely distinct from anything that we can point to or identify or mark in this material and created world. And yet that reality of the incalculable and immeasurable transcendence of this one divine creator is so remarkable in the sense that he has become flesh in the Son of God. That this eternal divine essence, the second person of this Holy Trinity, took upon himself humanity. He condescended to our level. He became one of us, yet free from sin and free from the curse of original sin. He accomplished what we failed. He achieved what we fell short of. But that does not change the divine nature of this very Son of God. He is, and as we confess every single week in both the Apostles' and Nicene creeds, he is of the same substance as the Father and the Spirit, and yet he came in the flesh. He is both fully God and fully man. True God of true God, as we would say in the Nicene Creed. His divinity was unchanged. He is the eternal God. And while we are so blessed and so thankful that this God indeed came in the flesh, that he now took upon himself humanity, that he would then reconcile that very humanity unto the very God, we must not lose sight of the fact that he is God. We must not lose sight of the fact that this deity is the one who created all things, that he is the one who controls in the palm of his hand the greatest and the mightiest of things in this universe, that the suns and stars, thousands of times the size of ours, are but a speck of sand to him, that the great vastness of the cosmos is but a speck, that we, compared to him, are nothing. Not that this would crush us, because indeed this very one to whom we are nothing also tells us that to him we are everything. And that he is not one who is capricious, he is not one who is arbitrary, as the false gods so often and evidently are and were. This God is holy, and we must not lose sight of that. That reality alone, I am Yahweh your God, is something which transcends time and space. It's something which transcends the various ages of history. This is a principle that hundreds of thousands and indeed millions of men in my position have been saying for millennia. Because this reality transcends time itself. That Yahweh is holy. That he is above and beyond all things. That we in our limited and finite mortality are ultimately incapable of truly and fully, commensurately conceptualizing the full weight of who this God is. This is why when the trials of Job occur in the book of Job, it is in chapters 38 and following that this Yahweh says to Job when he asks question of Yahweh, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I brought forth the mountains and lowered the valleys? Where were you when I rose the seas? Where were you when I brought forth lightning and thunder? Where were you when I breathed life into man?" This Yahweh is beyond and above. He is holy. And this should impact, in the deepest possible sense, every facet of our lives. This reality that our God is holy should keep firmly within our hearts and our minds two simultaneous realities. The first is that we are to fear him, that we are to remember that we are not God, to remember that we should not take him for granted nor treat him lightly, that we should not walk in triviality with regards to all that we do, that if we dare to call ourselves Christians, that if we dare to publicly proclaim before man that we are servants of this God, that we are his ambassadors, that we are his soldiers, then we must know that we bear the name of God, and that the public reputation of this God will inevitably be impacted by the thoughts and particularly conduct of his very ambassadors, us. His name can be magnified, and his name can transform the very fate of continents, as it has done for 2,000 years and counting. His name can also be brought into the most egregious of disrepute, and his name can be trampled underfoot by the conduct of his people. We have a most serious and severe responsibility to, out of love for this God and his service, do these works of love that are embodied in the very heart of the law. Indeed, that we should love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, and with all of our soul, and that we should therefore love our neighbour as ourselves. For this very same Christ who repeated the essence of the law unto his disciples also said, "If you love me, you will obey my commandments." This is why the Apostle James is able to then say in his epistle that faith without works is dead. But the one who professes to have faith, yet who does not walk and uphold as a pattern of life these works of the law, he or she does not actually have genuine faith. They do not actually trust Christ. They do not actually serve him. And that you can very much, in this particular instance, judge a book by its proverbial cover. This is to solemnly remind us of our duty This extends from the ends of our own private lives all the way to this very public service in which we are partaking here this morning. The holiness and the reverence of God is what must be our utmost and foremost priority. Because everything that we do in this liturgy, this Latin word from liturgos, meaning service, is just that, service. This service, where we joined with all of our brothers and sisters around the world, and as well as joined with those who have come before us by the very same Spirit, we do this service not for each other. We do it first and foremost for God and unto God, where you join in the presence of His temple, the church, His people, and bring the offering of your praises to Him, because He is worthy to be worshipped, especially, and I say this tongue-in-cheek, for at least an hour and a half, one day a week. Our lives are meant to be a pattern of this worship, daily reflecting that nature of God, that He is holy. Everything we do must be under the consideration that God is first, that God is highest, that God is the utmost in all things, that you were bought with a price. And speaking of that very price, this is what transitions us into the second subclause here. I am Yahweh your God, who, second clause, brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Before Yahweh commanded His people regarding the law, He first reinstated or reminded really the people of what He had done for them. We of course got this in passing, especially through the first 5 verses of chapter 5 last week. But here in this most succinct form, in this repetition of Exodus chapter 20, He reminds them of what He has done, that this was indeed the clear foundation upon which God was now going to give His commands, His law, the conditions of the covenant that He had now made with His people. And like that first subclause, we find 2 prominent principles that are derived from this second. The first of which is that God is sovereign. God is sovereign, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. There is, of course, the personal element which flows forth, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. But this, among many other things, highlights first and foremost that He is sovereign over all kings, over all nations, and over all the world. As we've highlighted before, at this time in history, in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, Egypt still stood as the most powerful kingdom and empire on earth. They were the hegemon of the world. They were the ones who commanded and influenced foreign policy and trade and economics and so on and so forth. Their military was the mightiest and most feared in all of the world. And by bringing them out of this land of Egypt, the Israelites, out of this place that is referred to as the house of slavery, for indeed they had existed in slavery for centuries by this point, Yahweh, our God, was demonstrating His sovereignty over the most powerful nation on earth. He was truly sovereign over the Pharaoh, this one who, as I mentioned earlier, was the very embodiment and personification of Horus, this divine king, this God king. He bent the knee to God. And when he turned against that and sought to draw sword one last time, he met his end. This very same Yahweh drowned him beneath the seas of the Red Sea. He and the army which he felt to be so mighty was nothing before God. And if this Yahweh, this God of these slaves, was able to bring all of the kingdom of Egypt to its knees, then he could bring anyone to their knees. The whole world watched as God crippled the most powerful nation on earth and brought it to nothing. Brought it to a point where Egypt's military might would not recover for at least a century, as far as we can tell from ancient records. They don't fight a single meaningful battle across that period while their army attempts to recover from the incredible loss in terms of sheer numbers. And the world witnessed this power of Yahweh, not of cruelty, not of bitterness, but of divine justice and of a holy vengeance against those who had held these Israelites in slavery. Cruel, brutal slavery. He brought Egypt to its knees. If he brings them to its knees, how then shall we fare? Would have been the perspective, and indeed, as we can tell from archaeological records, was the perspective of many of the nations around. Unless we think that for some reason we in our time have outgrown that, lest we think that the comparable example today, that of, for example, the United States of America, if we think that she is too mighty for Yahweh, one ought to think again. No matter how great we may conceptualize ourselves in the West, including our own nation, which has been remarkably blessed by this very same God, we must remember that if we depart from what is right and what is true and what is just, we too will be brought to our knees, and we will face the justice of God also. But to circle back to the essential principle, God is sovereign. And I referenced also how he is sovereign over creation itself. He displayed this, as I mentioned earlier, in all that led up to the Exodus, what we refer to as the 10 plagues of Egypt, where, as I suggested, he turned the blood to Nile, where he brought locusts and destroyed the crops, when he brought darkness upon the land, and so on and so forth, all the way up to this act of divine justice in this vengeance against the firstborn sons of Egypt. Again, not out of an arbitrary capriciousness, but in operation of that principle, an eye for an eye, equal justice. The Pharaoh had slaughtered the firstborn sons of the Israelites. Therefore, the justice he would face is that the firstborn sons of Egypt would be taken, including his own son. And I want you to see the power of this sovereignty that's being demonstrated, especially in that last one, the 10th. By bringing about the death, by taking the life of the crown prince of Egypt at the time, he was doing even more than just bringing justice against the Pharaoh and his household. He was, in a true, genuine sense, especially as far as the Egyptians were concerned, severing the royal line of divine succession. The whole theology and metaphysic in ancient Egypt was that, as I mentioned earlier also, that Horus would embody the Pharaoh, and that when he dies, Horus would then transfer into the new king, his son. And there was this succession tied in between the king and the god Horus. By killing that son, he severed this dark pagan line of divine royal succession That was the direct attack upon Horus, one of the most powerful gods and most renowned gods in ancient Egyptian culture. It struck at the very heart of the entire philosophy and theology and metaphysic of the kingdom of Egypt. It destroyed the very idea that the god Horus embodied the king, because now he'd killed the son of this king. He had now ended that royal divine line of succession, proving his sovereignty over both the king and Horus. This is his sovereign power. He is sovereign over all nature. He is sovereign over the very hearts of the rulers of earth. And the second principle this also teaches us in this second clause, that he's the one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, is that Yahweh is good. God is good. When we use good in our common parlance, we use it in generally trivial ways, which is fine because there's a colloquial sense to which we say the word good. We use it in small talk. How are you doing today? I'm good, thank you. Right? We also speak of performance as being good. We speak of emotion as being of a good state, and so on and so forth. But what I'm addressing here is not the more trivial end of the spectrum, but rather the deeper philosophical and theological sense of the word good, capital G, so it were. God is good. Not merely in an attributive sense that we measure him to be good, because that indeed is not what we do, but rather we rightfully identify what already is, which is that in and by his own right, God is good. That is to say, God is goodness. He is the very metric and standard of what constitutes good. He is not merely the embodiment of good, he is by nature good. And everything that comes forth from him, both in word and in deed, is therefore, logically of course, good. Everything that he brings forth is good. This is why at the end of each day that we find in Genesis chapter 1, when he has completed his work upon that day, what does he say? It is good. It is good. Because the creation, the material world in which we live, which we are very much ourselves a part of course, is fundamentally good. It is not fundamentally evil. This would be a very pagan, Gnostic idea. Creation, the material world, has been marred by the curse of sin that we ourselves bring forth. But as we've explained going through, the problem with the land of Canaan that they were now about to cross the Jordan River into was not the land, but the people who dwelt in it. The people who had corrupted that land by their own wickedness and evil, by their perverse religious practice, by their perverse sexual practice, by their human sacrifice, their child sacrifice, their ritual cultic sex slavery, so on and so forth. But the land of Canaan was referred to when God spoke to Abraham as what? Being a land of milk and honey. Right, a very common ancient Near Eastern idiom for a land that's blessed. The world itself, the material world, the creation, is good. And we ourselves here atop these blue mountains should know that as well as anyone else. For we exist in the midst of this natural beauty, as we would say. But this is because God is good. This is because he himself is by nature goodness. That is why what has been made by him is therefore good. In this particular instance, this specific phraseology, brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, is highlighting the practical outworking of his good, the fact that he does good in the world, and particularly and specifically here, unto his people. He has done good by them. He has rescued them. He has brought them out of the land of Egypt, this house of slavery that they existed in. And he did this not because of anything that the Israelites had ever done for him. They had by this time utterly forgotten who he even was. This is why even Moses, the prince of Egypt, an Israelite by ethnicity, has to ask him what is his name. They had nothing to bring, they had nothing to offer, because they could not, they would not, etc. There was nothing that these Israelites could ever hope to bargain God with, to bribe God with, to parlay God with. And yet, this Yahweh rescued them from the house of Egypt of his own will and by his own accord. Because he is good, and he therefore does good. He does not do it on account of something which humanity can offer him, because we have nothing to offer him. We have all kinds of things which we ourselves find impressive, which we ourselves find beautiful, which we ourselves find luxurious and resplendent and classy, and so on and so forth. We have a whole bunch of things that we can bribe each other with, that we can parlay each other with, that we can corrupt each other with. There is nothing you can corrupt this God with. There is nothing you can bribe him with. There is nothing that you can bargain him with. How can you bargain or bribe the very God who created the thing which you might even vainly try to bargain or bribe him with? How do you bribe one who is above all and who owns all things? The answer is you don't and you can't. He rescued the Israelites out of slavery for nothing more and nothing less than the reality, metaphysically, ontologically, that he is good. He is love. He is mercy. And he is described not as merely possessing these kinds of tangential attributes, or as being acclaimed as doing good or being merciful or gracious on account purely of the works, and we then actually give that kind of attributive proclamation. He ontologically, that is to say by nature, is good. He is merciful. He is gracious. He is loving. He is holy. He is just. He is righteous. He is all of these things. And therefore he has done this good because he is God. Why did he bring them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery? Because I am Yahweh your God. That second subclause, the why, the telos, the purpose, the teleological reason why he did that, is the first part of the sentence. Because I am Yahweh your God. That is why he did it. And why do we need to see that? Why does this principle transcend history, even to the point where we ourselves must know and understand this deep in our hearts? That we must have this dwell richly within our minds. It is because he gives that fundamental metaphysical principle. I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because I am Yahweh your God. Therefore, here are my commandments. If you love me, you will obey me. I want you to notice what's going on here, because this is something which flows from beginning to end in the scriptures, but it's something which is repeated over and over and over again, including by Christ in the Gospels multiple times, the apostles multiple times. It is not do these works of the law, uphold these commandments, and if you successfully do that, then I will conditionally bring you out of the land of Egypt to rescue you from the house of slavery. That would be the opposite of what's being said here. Do you see what I'm saying? Because he is Yahweh, he has therefore brought them out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And in responsive demonstration of love for that which has been done, here are the commandments of what is good and what is right in the world. Do these laws, fulfill these laws, uphold what is good and right and just in the world, because I, the God who is good and right and just, has rescued you from slavery. You cannot earn my ransom, you cannot earn my redemption that I give or that I have available. There is nothing which you can ever even possibly hope to achieve that will ever pay off what in human language we might say as is owed, quote unquote. You, mortal, are incapable. You cannot hope to transcend to the level of God himself. It is impossible, philosophically, to actually achieve what man so desperately and wantonly has strived to achieve through all manner of religious and philosophical machinations throughout the ages. One of the most unique principles and factors of the Christian religion is that, in contrast to every single other religious or philosophical system ever known to man, acts of righteousness, acts of justice, acts of love in the upholding and obeying of God's law is done not to earn favourable merit that will make one righteous, but instead is done in response to the righteousness of God which he has achieved on our behalf. The philosophical folly of every other religious or philosophical system, which so vainly imagines itself to be able to achieve a state of personal righteousness by simply outweighing proverbial good with proverbial bad, utterly, completely, and totally fails in the most commensurate sense to even get close to understanding the genuine nature of good and evil and the genuine nature of the divine standard of righteousness. It is an abject, catastrophic failure to understand, A, for starters, how completely corrosive and corrupt our evil actions are in the world when taken big picture, and on the very flip side, to actually understand the immeasurable and incalculable heights of what true metaphysical goodness actually is. We so horrendously drop the bar and level of goodness down to a level that we think we can hopefully aim for, and we also at the exact same time completely artificially raise up the threshold of what we consider to be evil, again to a level that we grossly underestimate, that allows us to continue on, hopefully sort of kind of assuaging our own conscience. He builds the entire giving of the law of what is fundamentally good, and these 10 commandments are the very heart of the principles of what constitutes good, capital G, in the world. He bases all of that upon this fundamental principle. He is Yahweh, your God, who is good and does good, is fundamentally what's meant by brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And this is highlighted to us particularly as you then continue on through the scriptures by the way this is then referenced elsewhere. We had in our Old Testament reading earlier in the liturgy from Micah chapter 6, verse 4, it again is this repetition where God says in his indictment against the Israelites who have abandoned the law and who have abandoned the goodness of God and who are practicing idolatry and human sacrifice and sexual ritual cultism and so on and so forth. In his indictment against their evil and their injustice, he again repeats this seminal phrase, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, I ransomed you from the house of slavery. Ransomed, in English, redeemed and ransomed are synonymous. I ransomed you. I redeemed you. Redeeming, redemption in a most literal etymological sense means to purchase something. Okay? We redeem things when many people are going to be redeeming things coming up to Christmas when they get a whole host of gift cards. Right? They redeem those gift cards. It's the price that's been paid for something already. Right, there is a prepaying of price, so it were. Yeah. This concept of redemption and ransom is far, far deeper than where we encounter it in gift cards. The nature of God redeeming people is again built upon this same premise. He has purchased his people by blood. Now let us consider something here with the great magnanimity of God and the incredible and immeasurable wonder of what he has done. In the Exodus, especially then the actual crossing of the Red Sea itself particularly, when it's all said and done, they cross safely to the land of Midian. He redeemed them from the house of slavery, this land of Egypt, and whose blood was spilt. Think. Firstly, it was the blood of the firstborn sons of Egypt, when the angel of death passed over. Then, in a final sense, it was the blood of the Egyptian army and the Pharaoh himself. Their deaths is what then safely allowed the Israelites to be rescued across the Red Sea. Are you following me? The blood of the enemies of God. And rightfully so, justly so. Again, we explained the whole concept of justice earlier, that interwove those various things. But it was their blood. We are then also redeemed in this new covenant. Yet how so are we redeemed? We covered this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the price of blood in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 41 to 43. We are then redeemed not by the blood of our enemies, not by our own blood, but we are actually redeemed by the blood of God. And indeed, this is how ultimately even the Israelites themselves were also redeemed. They were redeemed not by blood that they had to give. They were redeemed by the blood of Christ. They were redeemed by the blood of the one who is referred to as the blameless or the spotless lamb, the pure lamb, the one who was offered up as a sacrifice, though he himself had no blemish of evil in him. The Apostle Paul makes point of this in Titus chapter 2, for example, verse 14, where in reference to Christ he says unto us that Christ is the one who gave himself for us, that he might redeem us all from lawlessness and purify for himself a people for his own possession, zealous for good works. Zealous meaning passionate. Notice the difference of what's going on here. The Israelites were redeemed, they were ransomed, they were rescued from the house of slavery. Slavery to the Egyptians. Slavery to a state in which they had forgotten even who God was after so many centuries. Yet this house of slavery is likened unto all people in the way in which mankind itself too is also in the bondage of slavery. It also dwells in a house of slavery. Slavery to sin, slavery to evil, slavery to darkness, slavery to corruption, slavery to chaos, slavery to forces and powers that seek to bring nothing but evil, darkness, and chaos. That we are both victims of external things as well as being our own worst enemies. And this slavery to sin, slavery to death, slavery to chaos and to darkness is what has been ransomed by God. That through the blood of Christ, all those who bend the knee and submit to him do so not in submission to a tyrant who will bring them evil, who will bring them bad, who will bring them chaos and calamity, but rather submission to one who brings light and life and goodness and truth and beauty and all that is good and right and blessed in this world. It's a submission to good, not evil. It's a submission to right, not to wrong. It's a submission to light, not to darkness. It's a submission to order, not to chaos. And it's a willful submission. It's a submission that is a gift. It is a submission that is unearned. It is a submission that we are not even worthy of submitting unto. But this God, this Christ, by the spilling of his holy and sacred blood, has ransomed and redeemed us from the house of slavery to sin, from the house of slavery to death. And this is why then also the Apostle Peter is able to say in his first epistle, chapter 1, verses 18 and 19, that we are to know that we were not redeemed with corruptible things like silver or gold from your futile conduct inherited from your forefathers. No, but were redeemed, were ransomed, were rescued with precious blood, as of a lamb unblemished and spotless, the blood of Christ. We too have been redeemed. And our command is, all things considered, fundamentally the same at this kind of core principle level as what Moses is saying here to this generation of Israelites nearly 3,500 years ago from our time. That these 10 essential laws, these 10 fundamental principles, constitute what is good. And any other law that can come forth is and must be ultimately derived from these 10 fundamental principles, which we then have the privilege of exploring and exegeting in the new year. That this is what is good, not that I would bring you out of one form of slavery and corruption into another form of corrupt slavery, of a bondage that is burdensome, of a bondage that breaks you and buckles you, as that one did, as that slavery kept you in darkness, as that slavery kept you in evil and in chaos and in chains to corrupt powers beyond your capability to deal with. No, I'm redeeming you from this house of slavery, this house of bondage, that you would be brought into bondage to what is good, into bondage to be tied up, to be then tethered, like mooring to a dock as opposed to chainings to a rock. That you would now actually be tethered and anchored to what is good as opposed to chained to what is evil. We in our modern post-Enlightenment modernist culture reckon that liberty constitutes boundlessness, that liberty constitutes being able to do whatever on earth you want to do. That's not liberty. That's anarchy. That's not liberty. That's chaos. Order necessitates boundaries. Order necessitates limits that guard and protect the division between what is good and what is evil, between what is light and what is darkness, between what is right and what is wrong. These boundaries are not to enslave us to capriciousness, they are to anchor us to what's good. And so that when we then get into the Ten Commandments in the new year, we then must operate on this fundamental principle which God himself through Moses is explaining. That the law is not given, first and foremost, so that you might merit favour, blessing, salvation, that you might earn something for yourself, because you can't do it, it's impossible for you to do. It is a fool's errand in every possible sense of the word. And unlike the arbitrary, capricious false gods of the ancient or modern world, I, says Yahweh, give you these laws as the defining fundamental principles of what is good and brings blessing and human flourishing in the world. There's a reason why the West has risen to heights that no one else has historically. It is because across the course of the last 2,000 years, we built our civilization gradually and progressively, imperfectly, but yet righteously, upon these 10 commandments. That's why. And when our forefathers then traversed to foreign lands, again, imperfect as they were, on the whole they brought good, not evil. When they came to the Indian subcontinent and witnessed the horrific practice of sati, of the ritual burning of widows, for the mere fact that their husbands had died, the British went, no, not anymore. When the Spanish arrived in Mesoamerica and came upon the might of the Aztec Empire, who ruled not only themselves but particularly their neighbours in tyranny and fear, and came to the great temple of Tenochtitlan and saw the blood-stained steps of the tens of thousands of people that had been ritually sacrificed to the gods almost every year, they said no more, because thou shalt not murder. We have been successful, and our forefathers have been, because they ordered civilization upon those 10 commandments. And not that they would earn merit or favour with God, but rather in response to the fundamental principle that this Yahweh had rescued them and has rescued us and has rescued all Christians in the West or beyond from the house of slavery. Slavery to death, darkness, evil, and sin. Why? Because we'd earned it? No. Because we deserve it? No. Because we simply believe ourselves to be? No. Because Yahweh is God. Because he is who he is. Or as he would say, I am who I am. This is what we learn. This is what we and all peoples everywhere at all times must come to know. That Yahweh is God, and that he rescues people from the house of slavery, to sin, to death, and to darkness. And he does so through the redemptive power of his own blood shed upon the very earth that he created for us. And if we love him, we will, out of that love, obey his commands. For he is Yahweh, who brought you out of the house of slavery. Amen.